The Bob Murphy Show, episode 391.
There's a tidal wave coming. What you gonna do?
Get ready for another episode of The Bob Murphy Show, the podcast promoting free markets, free minds, and grateful souls. It's your source for commentary and interviews, conducted by a Christian and economist. Now here's your host, Bob Murphy.
Hey everybody, welcome back to the Bob Murphy Show. We have yet another crossover. This time, Adam Heyman comes to first ask me some questions his buddy has been asking him about the factors of production and land, labor, and capital goods and such. It's fascinating stuff. And then we talk about GDP calculations and the strategic Bitcoin reserve. And then finally, at the end, we talk about Trump's claim that they were transing the mice. And so I think it's a good episode all around. Lots to discuss. Hope you enjoy it.
Hello there, Bob.
Hey, Adam.
How have you been doing this week?
I'm doing all right now that I'm back in a good Wi-Fi zone.
Yeah, that last one was rough. People don't even know the technical hurdles. Well, I'm looking forward to discuss a bunch of things that have been going on this week. But first, I've got a question for an economics-minded person such as yourself, if you would indulge me.
All right, sure.
When I was a young man taking the Econ 101 in college, they talked to us about the factors of production, and that was land and labor and capital. And then at some point along there, they threw entrepreneurship onto the pile, and that was all neat. And then I was having a conversation with someone, I think it was Tyrone, about factors of production, and he was saying it basically all boiled down to labor anyway. Because after all, capital is simply crystallized labor. And then he had some throwaway line about why you could ignore land. And entrepreneurship obviously has a labor component. But it got me thinking, is that even a useful framework to think about things at all? Is there a reason they taught young budding economists about the factors of production, or is that just pointless?
I'll say some stuff and then you can take this however you want. So yeah, coming out of the classical school, and classical means pre-1871 marginal revolution. So
Yep.
People like Adam Smith, David Ricardo, David Hume, so forth, John Stuart Mill, and Karl Marx, by the way. So yeah, there the typical association was you got your three, as you say, types of factors, and they each corresponded to a certain type of income. So it was land, labor, and capital. And land earned rent, capital earned, they would call it profit, but that included what we mean by interest, and labor earns wages. And so that was the idea that, that's how they thought about stuff. And you still see to this day some of that carried through, right? Like clearly labor earns wages. It's not that, a tractor earns wages or something like that. And what do you pay? Who do you pay rent to? The landlord, right? So the landowner. So that's where they were coming from. And then, ultimately, though, there were a lot of the classical economists had a cost theory of value that kind of reduced to a labor theory of value, and it's along the lines of what you're saying, Tyrone said, that the idea was there was what's called the original factors of production, which is just land and labor. And land is a broader term referring to all the like natural resources. It's not just agricultural land,
Yep.
If you had a gold mine or something. So as Tyrone was anticipating, that they were arguing that, ultimately the income that you would own from owning a collection of capital goods like a stagecoach or something or a railroad, that was ultimately in the long run, that was just decomposed into the original factors of production, right? Because that was just like congealed labor and land forces. And then even the nature, the land stuff, like there, the idea was, it's not that nature charges us for its services or for her services. right? I didn't want to misgender nature, right? So, and so that was the sense in which it was construed as the ultimate check on or break on, spelled BRAKE, if you're getting the sense in which I'm using it, on the flow of output is humans' desire for leisure, right? And like, did you have to motivate a human to provide labor services, and so that was the idea in terms of how they were explaining, backwards, step by step, that, why does this thing earn this amount in the long run equilibrium? Well, because the costs of production are such and such. But what then, why are those like that? And you could just keep pushing it back. And then ultimately, so the thinking went, it ultimately, the rock bottom was, because there's a human that you got to motivate them. They would prefer just to spend their leisure doing with whatever they want, and to get them to work for you and to, turn their hour into an hour of labor as opposed to leisure, you got to pay them. So that's where that's coming from. And you could do it that way. There's I'll just mention one problem with that is the stuff with the nature given factors. You can't make that work. That doesn't really work. That if there's scarcity, then ultimately, it's a human owner, of course, who owns, the agricultural land or the gold mine or copper mine or whatever it is. But that doesn't disappear even in the long run, that there's always scarcity. They can always charge a rent for that. So that it's not that washes away. And so when you're trying to explain the value of something in the marketplace, even if you're using that sort of cost of production approach, you're not going to whittle away the contribution of Mother Nature in that sense, even though it's like a human owner who's charging for it. All right, so I'll stop there, and I don't know if you want to.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. Couple more questions. I remember Rothbard in Man, Economy, and State, or maybe he didn't originate it, but I remember him showing us the evenly rotating economy and how, interest spun out of, all the things. So when you were talking, it reminded me of that. But further, unless you were teaching a history of economic thought, like nowadays, if you were just going to teach economics and you weren't worried about how they used to talk about it back then, would you even introduce the concept of factors of production, or would you move along to something else and frame things differently?
Good question. So for sure, that rigid distinction between like capital earns profit or interest and land earns rent, that dissolved, right? That as economics developed, they realized that no, any productive factor earns a rental income per unit time, and interest is just the return on financial capital. So the real quick example that Irving Fisher used to show that is, let's say there's a plot of farmland, and you can rent it out for $10,000 a year, right? So like sharecroppers or whoever can come and they'll pay you $10,000 a year for the use of that land. And then suppose the market price of that same plot of land is $100,000 right now, the spot price. And so you have $100,000 in your bank account, you buy the land, and then every year you rent it out and people pay you $10,000 to rent it from you. So the $10,000 you're earning, that's clearly income. And what is it? Is it interest or is it rent? And the answer is it's both. It's, $10,000 is the rental income due to the physical productivity of your land, right? People can grow more crops using your land than if they don't have access to it. So that's why they're willing to pay you. But at the same time, it's a 10% rate of return on your invested financial capital. So anyway, just to kind of show how those things go together. And then in a sense, even wages are like, the same principles that you would use to explain the rental price of a tractor. That's exactly what you'd use to explain the rental price of a human being. And in the case of a slave, that's, it's literally the same thing.
Literally, yeah.
Whereas with, free labor, it's, you're just renting it out. You can't buy the capitalized value of the whole asset. But it's the same concepts to explain, what's the per hour rental rate of that human body. It's the same. It's the marginal productivity. So that's the way it's talking about. But you're framing it as factors of production. Oh, yes, like totally. You need to know, what the entrepreneurs, what are the things they buy in order to produce goods and services for their customers. like, yeah, you got to break it down. But I'm just saying that the categories and in having one type class of factor that points to a type of income, that has dissolved, and that's not the way we think about it now.
Excellent. And am I correct in thinking that adjusted for risk, or assuming away risk, that both land and capital would earn the same return?
In terms of the financial capital, yes. So, and also too, it's kind of related to your question. The distinction between like a capital good and land is also a little bit arbitrary, because technically a capital good is like a non-human factor of production that was produced, whereas land is like nature given. And so in terms of the economics, what do we care? And then also in practice, there's barely anything now that is literally just nature given that we haven't augmented somehow. Right. So it's not like there's this pristine thing. But in terms of the economics, if you're out in the woods and you come across some alien machine that fell from the sky, you go, oh, is that a capital good or is it nature? You know what I mean? It doesn't matter.
Right.
And it's also certainly not, you would need to know how many labor hours went into it before, it doesn't matter. Right. So the reason Rothbard in Man, Economy, and State explains, he said, really the distinction, it's not so much whether historically a particular thing that is a factor of production was produced by humans or just given raw by nature. That's not really the issue. The issue is it reproducible? And that's the linchpin, because kind of going back to what you're saying, if it is reproducible, then it's got to be that the rate of return in that, like if there was a higher rate of return in that thing, like, if you could go use it and earn $1,000 an hour renting the thing out, or, employing it in some production process, but it only cost $10 to make another unit of that thing, there would be a ton, resources flowing into cranking out more units of that, whereas you can't just go make more gold mines or something, right? So there's that element. To answer your question though, what happens is, yes, for a given amount of risk, the rate of return, like percentage wise in the financial capital, gets equalized, but that's because the spot price just adjusts, right? So that, if there was, you're pulling out, a harvest from some agricultural land, and then there's another piece of land that's down the road, and then something changes, it's such that the productivity of the one down the road, gets cut in half. People are still just paying you for the crops that you're selling in the marketplace, right? Nobody cares about your rate of return. They're just paying you like, oh, I got this many tomatoes of this quality, and this is how much I'll pay you for them. But what happens is, if the productivity falls on the other one, to keep the financial rate of return the same between the two plots of land, the market capitalized price of the other one, gets cut in half. Right. So that's kind of how things adjust, such that the rates of return get equalized, again, like you say, for comparable levels of risk.
Very, very good. And did you answer my question? Would you even bring it up in a modern setting without talking about the history of economic thought?
Well, it depends. I can't remember what I did in lessons for the year. So certainly you got to explain, like, what's the difference between capital goods and nature or natural. We probably now call them natural resources, not just call it land, and labor. Strictly speaking, is it tripartite? Is that even a word? That threefold distinction is somewhat arbitrary, right? It's partly just like, well, because humans are so special, but like, what happens when there's AI powered robots? And is that a capital good or is that labor? It's gonna start getting a little bit wonky. So a lot of that really is just kind of for historical reasons that we have those three categories. Because again, the principles determining the pay, the payment you get, the rental price for a unit of output, whether it's a unit of a natural resource or a capital good or labor, it's the same principles to explain the pricing of those three things. So there's a sense in which, why do you have it? I still had that stuff in my lessons with the economist. Quick funny story: when I taught this stuff at Mises University, I would start out with the threefold and say, this is how the classical economists, they thought land earned rent, and labor earns wages, and capital earns interest or profit, and then I like put an X through some of it to say this is wrong, and nowadays we think of it blah blah blah. But then a lot of the kids just all they remembered was the first 10 minutes, and then they kind of zoned out. And I realized, no, I should stop telling them, now here's what's wrong, and now let me tell you, because by the end, they just remembered that first thing, the primacy effect. So I did stop teaching it that way because I realized I was, reinforcing bad habits.
All right, last question then on this subject. What do you think about throwing entrepreneurship onto that framework? Because in the evenly rotating economy, it doesn't exist. Do you think it's sort of a icing on the cake, or a cheat, or being cute, or it's the discovery process that makes everything work, but it's not really a factor of production, right?
Right. So what I can say for sure is that Israel Kirzner did not think of it as a separate input. To him, it was like, no, you have the inputs, and then it's the entrepreneur who sees the opportunity to say, I can use these inputs in a novel way, that others have overlooked, and therefore blah, blah, blah. And that he thought it was just kind of pushing the problem back if you would call entrepreneurship a separate factor of production, because then still it would leave open the question, okay, well then how come, that this guy has a higher rate of return than that guy? Well, he has more entrepreneurship that he pumped. It just gets a little arbitrary. And then what if someone else thought of a better way to use his own entrepreneurship? Then it would be like entrepreneurship squared or something, so he just thought it was simpler just to say, no, entrepreneurship is the overarching thing that uses these ingredients, and that, that's how he explained it. So yeah, you could, another thing too is some people would add time in as an element, or like patience or waiting or something. And that was one way you could try to explain interest. But ultimately, it seems like that's just kind of adding entities into the explanation that you could just handle more simply. So, right. I personally, obviously entrepreneurship is very important, but I would not classify it as a factor of production. I would, again, say it's more like the overarching thing that uses the factors of production.
Yep, that works for me. All right, well, thank you much for that. This is sort of an awkward segue. Speaking of what are things that are neither natural resources or capital or come from an alien civilization, Bitcoin and the idea of the National Bitcoin Reserve. That topic has popped up in the last month for obvious reasons. I'm sure you have thoughts.
Well, yeah, and I am also curious to hear your thoughts as well. So my take on this, and I can't divorce myself from the political context and how it's my knee-jerk reaction now is when people complain about something the Trump administration does, unless it's pretty egregious, I'm reflexively going to defend them. And you know what I mean? Because the attacks are so strident and, this is fascism and this is just blah, blah. So anyway,
I'll give you my...
if the Biden administration were doing this, I'm sure my feelings would be different. I'll admit that. But yeah, my quick take is I have been giving qualified defenses of this concept, at least, not necessarily the mechanics of how they're doing it, in print and, on other by the Infi podcast that I do for Infinio. And the quick version is if I were advising a private company and they had, reserves, like a portfolio, and they had like gold as an inflation hedge and some other stuff, and they had no Bitcoin, I would say, yeah, I would think you would want to get some Bitcoin into the mix. And so likewise with the U.S. government, I think it is entirely possible that 10 years from now, Bitcoin is going to be not necessarily like the global reserve currency or something, but I think it's going to be held more broadly around the world, and it's going to be up there with gold as, an alternative that people can just go to that, transcends boundaries and national, jurisdictions and whatnot. And so in that sense, I think eventually we're going to get to a point where all the governments and corporations are holding some Bitcoin just as a matter of course, just as a matter of doing business with other earthlings. And so if that's true, then at some point, some big government's going to have to be the first one to start stockpiling it, and they're going to clearly have a first mover advantage. So why not do that right now? That's kind of my take.
No, I'm glad you said that. My dumb guy take is that I'm not really thrilled that the government has the strategic oil reserve, and I'm not thrilled that they're pocketing so much gold, ostensibly, maybe in Fort Knox. And, I'm not thrilled that my taxpayer dollars are being used to either augment certain asset classes or manipulate the quantity supplied or whatnot. But given that all that stuff happens, and no one's really complaining about it, what's so different about this weird asset category? It's just new, as you said, and I don't see what the if you're not an anarchist, I don't see why you care. This is just one more thing.
Right. And I totally understand that people who are, have been holding a lot of Bitcoin, like Michael Saylor or something, clearly he wants the U.S. government to stockpile Bitcoin. It's going to be hard for him to say, like, what's the difference between what's good for, global freedom and what's good for my company. I get it. And it's hard to, but again, somebody who for a while has thought, oh, Bitcoin's the wave of the future. It's going to just keep going up and up because it's so awesome. And everyone's going to, more and more people are going to come to see that. What would you do? You would start having your own company or, household stockpile Bitcoin. And then to the extent that you could advise, especially a market-friendly administration that came in that's got a bunch of pro-crypto people involved, you would say, yeah, start stockpiling Bitcoin. That's going to be good for U.S. taxpayers. You know what I mean? So I understand why, oh, geez, it looks like a naked conflict of interest. But on the other hand, it would be weird if somebody thought, yeah, I think my private company should be stockpiling this, but I don't want the U.S. taxpayers to benefit from this. Let me just mention, and so I have written some things about, like, hey, if they're going to do this, there's better and more foolish ways of doing it. And so, yeah, I don't want there to be any new issuance of debt to do it. And, people have talked about, well, the government owns 8,000 plus tons of gold, at least on paper, and they're carrying it at $42 an ounce, but, back as a throwback to the Nixon administration when they were revaluing it. That's goofy. You could revalue that, sell off even just a small fraction of that, and you could buy hundreds of billions of dollars worth of Bitcoin, right? So you could do stuff like that. And I've even seen proposals saying, like, just reducing it so that the government holds the same fraction of the global Bitcoin supply as it does of the global gold supply, right? So that kind of neuters the argument about government intervening in the market and to say, well, why is it okay if they intervene in the gold market? And the other thing too, I haven't seen anyone else pick this up, but the government right now owns like 93% of student loans. The federal government does. And this isn't something that, in case people don't know, this isn't like, oh yeah, it's always been like it. No, it hasn't. It exploded under the Obama administration with the, whatever that was called, their AARA or something, that Recovery Act that Obama had passed when he first came in. If you look at a chart of measured like in dollars of total student loans held by the federal government, it just starts exploding under the Obama years and it kept rising rapidly, such that now it's like 1.4 trillion. So I realized you couldn't just sell those off dollar for dollar to people in the private sector, but okay, sell $1 trillion of face value of that for $200 billion to investors, and give them that kind of a discount, and then go buy $200 billion worth of Bitcoin. And to me, it would be hard to say, oh, but that's government intervention. Well, is it free market for the government to own 93% of student loans?
Right.
So.
Right. Do you want to give a comment about, some people speculate that creating this Bitcoin reserve is going to be a way that the government gets itself out of debt because, after all, the price go up or whatever.
Right. Yeah. So that was another thing that I wrote up, was clearly this is going to open Pandora's box. And then, was it Trump that tweeted out something about, having some other crypto coins in there that were kind of caught people by surprise, and, Saifedean, I think, had a stroke. So I understand, it looks, oh, geez, you open up Pandora's box, now this is crazy, and then we're going to start buying penny stocks too? Geez, give me a break. I understand, but still, say there's a way they could do it that would be better. And I was saying that you're right, that what you don't want is for them to be able just to come in and, manipulate the market so easily. So I said, if they were going to do it, it would make sense to do something like, I just kind of made this up, but this is the kind of thing I mean, where if you had this enshrined in the authorizing, legislation or whatever, something like, the government will accumulate Bitcoin according to this schedule, and then, it'll stop buying based on these parameters, and then it'll hold it, and it will just continue to hold it. And if the total value, like based on a 30-day moving average of the spot price of Bitcoin, if the U.S. government's holdings exceed 50% of U.S. GDP at that point, then they will start selling 1% per month, and the percent measured like in terms of Bitcoins, like physically, 1% of their physical stockpile they'll sell per month, at a steady rate, and use that just to buy back outstanding U.S. Treasury debt. Like that's the only thing it can be used for until such time as, the 30-day moving average, they're back below 50% of U.S. GDP or the Treasury debt's retired. So I just kind of made those numbers up, but that's the kind of thing I think you'd want to have in place, because otherwise the Bitcoin bros, once it's got established, they would never want them to sell it.
Right.
Because it's just going to push down the price.
Right.
So if you got people to go along with it, like, hey, we can kind of use this to help pay down the national debt. Suppose Bitcoin goes up 50x again. If we stockpile a bunch of this, boom, we can. But you can only pay off the debt if you can sell it and use it to retire the debt. So anyway, that's what I think that they should. If they are going to do this thing, they really should try to put down some principles to at least try to steer it in the right direction. Obviously, we know how government cheats and say, "Whoa, look, they had a constitution, so everything should be fine." I get it, but it's better that there's a First Amendment than if there hadn't been a First Amendment.
Right. Well, you mentioned GDP, so let's pivot to that. Elon says GDP is dumb, and so do I. Are we going to get rid of it as a metric, or what should we use instead? Or is Elon an idiot, and so am I?
I don't think Elon's an idiot.
Hey, now.
So, the context here is the Atlanta Fed came out with their GDP Now forecast or whatever, and there was a period, I think it was in February, where like in a 10-day span or something, it went from them saying there was going to be 2% plus positive growth in GDP in the first quarter to then it's shrinking, right? So in a very short period of time, their forecast for the first quarter went from, expansion down to contraction. And I think some of it was due to like the tariff talk and, fears of retaliation, stuff like that, trade war. But I think some of it also was they were just building in, hey, if government spending cuts are implemented the way this Doge people are talking, government spending is part of GDP, and that's going to reduce GDP. There you go. And so hence recession. And so Elon was responding to that, and he said, this is kind of silly. I'm paraphrasing here, but it's silly that government spending is included as part of GDP because, and he came up with some scenario like to illustrate the issue that it was like, what if a bunch of people working for the car companies instead switched and started working for the DMV? And he was saying, so, that wouldn't change GDP, right? Like the government's paying their wages, that would still, the flow of their services would still go into GDP for that period. But clearly, instead of them making cars, now they're doing useless stuff at the DMV. So the American people, their welfare has dropped, even though GDP stayed the same, right? So that was the point he was trying to make. And I think that was, he probably could have been crisper in terms of the exposition, but I think his intuition was correct. And so certainly to the extent that if official GDP were lower because Doge actually did get a bunch of spending cuts to go through, then I would say, that in that case, the GDP metric is not doing what we use it for, right? That when the government spends $100 billion buying stuff, that's not the same contribution to economic output as if the private sector does. And I'm not being ideological when I'm saying it's not just like, I don't like the government. I'm saying no, for the reasons that as an economist, you would say, well, gee, if this household spends $10 on a milkshake and this household spends $10 on a pack of baseball cards, that's $20 total of economic output. And it makes sense to add those together for the big total. There's a plausibility there because the households all could spend their money on all the different available goods, right? So there is a sense in which for those people, they valued, the fact they were willing to spend $10 means that is, quote, worth $10. But if the government spends $10 on something, that doesn't mean anybody in society actually values that thing at $10. You know what I mean? Because the people in the government authorizing the spending, they can't take that money if they choose not to spend it on that and go spend it on something else, because that would be, that'd be called corruption or, stealing from the public purse. So for that reason, I think Elon's right. And a good example of this is at the end of World War II, official GDP from like 1945 to 46 dropped by like 0.2%, but the private component of GDP jumped 40% in 1 year. Mm-hmm. So in terms of people on the home front looking around, like the amount of stuff, the flow of goods and services they had available went way up, even though technically that was marked as a recession. And so I think that, and there you could say, well, fight the Nazis and the Japanese was a good thing to do or whatever. Okay, but that wasn't flowing into the GDP. You know what I mean? If they had just done the same expenditure to go build battleships and send them in the ocean and sink them, they would have done the same thing to GDP is kind of the point. So to the extent that you think Doge is cutting things that aren't really important, then I think Elon's point holds.
So you mentioned, obviously, they keep all these statistics, and so we do know what the private portion of GDP is, but you only ever hear about the raw number or the gross number. Is it just because I'm not looking in the right places, or do people actually use the private portion of GDP as something useful to watch, or maybe the ratio between private to government? I mean, it seems like there should be a way to make this information more useful to us if GDP isn't all that useful.
Right. So yes, like you can, like I said, I went and did it at the Infi podcast, folks. We'll put a link in the show notes page here, but I just had an episode come out where I did it. I have the actual graph to see it. It's, so yes, you can, what it is, people vaguely remember from college, it was, Y equals C plus I plus G plus X, net, which is net X. So it's total output is private consumption, private investment, government, and net exports, right? That's the four components. So yeah, they have all those different data sets and you can go and look at that. So, and this was, some people were pushing back on Elon and saying, they already do publish that, you idiot. In fairness, I don't think Elon's point was to say we should go collect those numbers. I think he was saying correctly, right now, when they report GDP, they include government spending, and they should stop doing that, because that means if there's a period like right now where government spending falls rapidly, that's going to be clocked as a recession. That's actually not. Even though it's possible Americans' welfare, in any normal measurement is going up. So that's, I don't know if I'm answering your question. Yeah, they have those numbers. They can just look at those. And the point is that instead of everybody referring to the GDP number is the headline statistic, I think Elon's point was they should stop doing that, because then that unfairly stacks the deck against, regimes that are cutting spending, government spending.
Yeah, no, it makes sense to me. I kick myself because I always forget the name of it, but Gene Epstein, formerly of Barron's and now running the Soho Forum, he has a metric that he advocates as being much better than GDP, but I can't remember the name of it. Do you remember? Something about gross output or something?
Contributions to the Soho budget.
Well, he's right about that. What else do we need to think about?
Yeah.
Gross
I know.
total
Well, I know.
output
Yeah. Mark Skousen was big on this too, and I don't know if Gene's is different or if he, is endorsing what Mark Skousen. Yeah. Shoot. What the heck is it? It's gross. I think it is like gross output, something like that. I forget. But yes, to answer your question, that I have seen other. Well, what Skousen does now, it's coming back to me. I don't remember if this is what Gene's talking about. I do know what you're talking about, Adam, in the sense that I have read him when he pontificates on this stuff. For sure, though, what Skousen is putting his finger on, I don't think it's so much that he's netting out government spending, but his deal is GDP refers to the gross domestic production of final goods and services. Okay. And so that word final there is doing a lot of work. And like in the canonical example, like in a textbook that you would see, it's like, oh, there's a $1 worth of grain that's harvested. or wheat that's harvested, and then that goes to the miller, and he grinds it up and he turns it into $2 of flour, and then that goes to the baker, and then he turns it into a raw loaf of bread that's $3 that gets sliced up, and then that goes to the wholesaler, and then it ends up and it's a loaf of bread that finally at the grocery store that's $5. And so that if the consumer then spends $5 on that, the only contribution to GDP is just $5, even though it's 1 plus 2 plus 3 plus 4 plus 5 has been spent all along the chain, because they're like looking at the value. You can either look at it as the value added at each step or just at the final one. And so the problem with doing that is it tends to exaggerate the importance of consumer spending, because let's just say that happens period after period, that that each capitalist at each stage, like the guy at stage 2 is spending $1 to get the wheat, and then he mixes his thing in and he sells it for $2 to the next guy, and like that. And so the point is that guy has to be reinvesting $1 every period just to keep the thing going. And the guy, like in the second last stage, has to be spending $4 to get the raw input, and then he adds $1 and sells the final loaf to the consumer. So the point is that just gets that's not called net investments, right? So when GDP is decomposed into consumption, investment, government, and net exports, the I is net investment. It doesn't count all of the the spending that I just said there. It would have to be like if you went out and bought a new oven, then for that one period, the amount you spent on the oven would go into net investment. It would go into GDP. But other than that, no, just wherever the consumer is spending the $5 on the loaf of bread, that's it. And so that tends to exaggerate the importance of consumer spending and make it look like investment's not that big a deal, when really, when you look at the total flows of expenditures, it's mostly business people spending on inputs, and the consumers are just like a small fraction of it. So that's Skousen's deal, is to come up with a measurement that captures all that spending at the intermediate stages.
So maybe it's my anarchist bias, but big aggregate numbers like this always are metrics always seemed really, really dumb to me. So I had a weird thought and a weird question. If governments were just abolished tomorrow and we lived in an anarchist society, free, prosperous, peaceful, would anybody try to figure out any sort of economic thing like GDP? What sort of big aggregate things would people care about, or would we? Is it just the fact that we're trapped in nation states that we think about this sort of thing at all?
It's a really good question. I mean, so for sure you would still have accounting,
Sure.
corporations and things would still,
Sure.
or some people say, no, corporations are a creature of the state. Large companies,
Yeah, sure.
we can quibble about whether they would be owned by corporations or not. Sheldon Richmond thinks they would still be, the corporate form would exist. But yeah, they obviously, have internal accounting, bookkeeping, just to manage their own operations. So you clearly would still have that sort of thing. But you're right. I think it might be analogous to right now we have rich data on individual countries, but you don't see too much people talking about like what's Earth's GDP last year. You know what I mean? And so I think it would be analogous to that yeah, you could, if you had all these corporations and you had, various individuals, and you could talk about the world's 100 richest people and stuff in the anarcho-capitalist globe, and you could do, but in terms of, would someone say, what if we just added up all these numbers? Like, and say, what about all the people that live between these 2 points of longitude? Let's
Right.
figure out all the house, you could, but it'd be like, what's the average temperature of the homes in Phoenix? Or like, yeah, you could do that, but what would you use it for? So
Okay, it's A
I think it'd
through
be like
M versus N through Z. Who makes more?
Yeah. So I think that, that kind of sheds light on it, that people might, as a curiosity or something, do things like that. Economic historians might want to try to get some sense of, is the economy, global economy, growing faster, the economy in this region, if people have different types of, institutional structures in different areas, try to assess the benefits or whatnot. But again, I think the only really accurate bookkeeping would be for people that are doing it to guide their entrepreneurial decisions. Having said that, I mean, there could be really large owners of, various, I don't know what you want to call it, regimes or something that would, like a property developer might have a little neighborhood somewhere and there'd be like a gated community and they could have rules about this is, at 10 p.m. is quiet hours. You can't play loud music and you can't paint your house purple. There's all kinds of things like that that would be consistent with an anarcho-capitalist legal system.
Sure.
And so conceivably, if there's, really big areas that follow a certain type of legal code, and then there's another one far away that has people that are they have way different religious beliefs or whatever, and maybe somebody would care just as a profit, maximizing guy to see what's growth like in this region versus that region. They might keep some statistics like that, but anyway, I think that's kind of how I would look at it. And you can see that's it clearly, like World War II. That's why all these data sets typically start after World War II, right? Because all the major governments, of course, they expanded greatly during the war, including things like, record keeping, or partly for tax reasons. Like, right, if you're going to extract a bunch of revenue, you got to keep track of everybody, know how much they're earning.
Right.
And so it's not a coincidence that a lot of these data sets start in, 1946 or 1947, because that's when the administrative state got real big. And then they said, okay, now we're done blowing everybody up. What are we going to do with all this power? I know, let's keep track of everything and spend it on, ending poverty.
All right. Well, as Mom and Dad told us, after you've eaten your vegetables and meats, you can finally have your dessert. So we've talked about several economic concepts and topics. So now, okay, Bob, we can do what you want. We can talk about those transgendered mice.
Yes. So this is just yet another example, folks, of the phenomenon that Adam and I talked about in a previous episode about arguing with midwits, where the Trump comes out, and it was during his State of the Union that wasn't a State of the Union. What was it? Joint address to Congress? Is that what they called it?
Something like that, yeah.
And he had a line in there about let me see if I can find it, because I had it a year ago. Just listen to some of the appalling waste we've already identified, Trump saying in the speech. $8 million for making mice transgender. This is real. Okay, so that's the line. And then there was, a whole wave of outrage about that. So again, it was the sort of midwit thing. And again, midwit doesn't mean stupid. Remember, folks, that what I'm saying is people who are slightly above average in terms of intelligence and certainly educational pedigree, but then they go to, these rubes, and they explain stuff away. And so this is just the particular way this controversy unfolded, and I was a participant in it, so that's why I remember this. So the original way to mock Trump and his allies for that line in the speech was to say, no, you idiots. What they're referring to, what the research grants were talking about, where people were doing studies on transgenic mice, which just means, they had some genes altered. It has nothing to do with, trans people, you idiots. And I, that was floating around for a while. And there were people like PhDs literally who were just, hey, MAGA people, do you know that there's the Department of Transportation? Do you think that we're, changing the peepees on all the cars? You idiot. I mean, like, I'm not putting words in them. That's what they were saying. They were finding words that also had, like the transatlantic slave trade. And, I guess that was about, chopping off all that kind of stuff, right? To just drive home how stupid Trump was and how he doesn't even understand the Doge team, can't even read medical journals. So then, the White House posted a thing showing, no, there's lots of examples of funding for things that were clearly involved with, trans surgeries and whatnot, therapy.
I'm staring at it right now. It came out March 5th. We're recording this on March 10th. And it's testing the effects of gender-affirming hormone therapy on this and that and the other in mice. And there's 5 or 6 different examples that look an awful lot like that.
And so then when that happened, there was no, obviously, apology like, sorry, we just made up a bunch of stuff that turned out to blow up in our face. No, then it was, No, well, if you go look at these studies, it's doing things like seeing how if you inject the mouse with estrogen, what does that do in terms of, cancer treatment, or does that reduce the efficacy of the, and so this isn't just about trans women, like men, people who are born men and then, get a bunch of estrogen injected into them and then to see if they happen to have cancer or, will the standard cancer treatments affect them differently, blah, blah, blah. Women have estrogen. Don't you know that like biological women have estrogen too? And they were getting all huffy, like, I want women to die of cancer, right? And so that was the way they played it too, that this is applicable. This isn't narrowly about that. And so then, like you say, Adam, I went and I found one. Here's one. Microbiome-mediated effects of gender-affirming hormone therapy in mice. Okay, from Emory University, but a project. I won't read this whole thing, folks, but just to give you an idea. So this the abstract from this research. Gender-affirming hormone therapy is used by transgender people to alleviate gender dysphoria. For male to female subjects, consists of a gonadotropin-releasing hormone, blah, 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 testosterone production, and okay, so they're explaining that. And the gut microbiome is pivotal regulator of skeleton postnatal maturation, bone health, and bone responsiveness to this, and sex steroids. Moreover, blah, 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 right? So it'd be silly for me to sit there and try to read this, but it's clearly just saying we want to see how injecting people with this for the purpose of gender-affirming hormone therapy, will that mess with their bone, their skeletal development and stuff like that, right? So it's not saying in general we want to know like females and are their bones brittle, and then, why don't we inject a mouse with some estrogen? And this also would help with trans people. No, this is clearly just studying what will be the effects of doing gender-affirming treatment to people, right? That's clearly what this is 100% about. So then when presented with this one, the fallback was, but they're not trying to take a female mouse and turn it into a male mouse. All they're doing is injecting the female mouse with testosterone to see how does that affect, the skeletal development. So they're not transing the mice, you dorks, and so that was the thing. And so again, my big picture is, do you think the MAGA people that were outraged at the funding of the $8 million for this, that if you explain to them, no, we just want to make sure when we're transing kids that we don't screw up their skeletal development. That's why we're testing on the mice first. They were like, okay, go ahead then. We thought you were trying to turn a male mouse into a female mouse, and that's where we draw the line with tax. That's what I'm saying. And again, and not like, yes, the last three things we've said in this debate were just completely wrong. We just made that up. But now, we're sure we're right on this one, and Trump is such a liar. Like, anyway, it was just astonishing to me. And there was a Reason article that came out that, I got a good 10,000 hearts on it. Actually, I think it went up to 11. So it was one of my best performing tweets of recent. And it was just hilarious that it starts out, let's see, the title is, "No, HHS didn't spend $8 million making mice transgender." This is from this guy, Joe Lancaster. And so he's going through, he quoted, that's where I just read from a minute ago, quoted Trump saying that. And he said, "Indeed, spending $8 million to make mice transgender would be an appalling waste of tax money if it were real. Thankfully, it isn't." Okay. And then he goes through, and here's a nice sentence from the same article. "Indeed, at most, the listed NIH grants describe studies in which scientists are studying the effects of gender-affirming hormones on mice and not, quote, making mice transgender." Okay, so that's the thing. And I had that little screenshot that got, 10 to 11,000 hearts, because for a lot of people, what's funny is that is such a hair-splitting distinction. A lot of people literally didn't even get it. And they were saying, they were getting mad at me. And they were saying, "So Bob, they're making mice transgender." And I said, "No, they're not." And they were outraged at me, like, "What are you, an idiot?" And it's like, no. The point they're making here is they're saying they weren't trying to take a male mouse and turn it into a female mouse. All they were doing was saying, when we're trying, the treatment we use to turn a human male ostensibly into a female male, we're doing that to the mice to see what happens. That's what we're studying. We're not actually trying to trans the mice, you morons. So anyway, that was the thing. What's funny too is, we're kind of analyzing this, and the Reason people too, from the point of view of objective reality, where this stuff is all stupid. But in the world of the trans stuff, you say, well, how do you know you're not transing the mice? Did you ask them? Right? How do we know? I mean, it's not enough it's not the physical anatomy that doesn't determine. So how do we know?
You
And,
measure the pitch of the squeak.
and I would say, arguably Mickey Mouse. I mean, oh boy,
Oh,
turtles. I mean, that's for people. It's a clubhouse thing for parents. So it's arguably Mickey and Minnie. Anyway,
That's all great stuff. I just want to pile on by making a deeper, if obvious point that no matter how you feel about these particular projects, when you fund science with taxpayer dollars, somebody is going to think what you're doing is wrong and stupid and a waste. And so maybe, and I would guess most MAGA people don't think about it like this. They probably think that the government should fund science too. They just probably have a different list of things that they want that money spent on that, isn't testing these transing the mice things. But no matter how the political process decides to allocate government grant money for science, somebody is going to be annoyed. And by definition, I think economically it's wasteful because it wasn't consumers making that choice or corporations or anything like that.
I get what you're saying. I wonder though, isn't there something about like the average person just minding his own business? There's so much going on. I got to take my kids to soccer. We got this presentation at work next week, and oh man, egg prices are through the roof, and they don't have time to keep track of all that. And like, should we spend money on a super collider or studying black hole? I don't know. But should we spend $8 million injecting mice with estrogen to help with transing kids? No, absolutely not. That's crazy. You know what I mean? So I feel like there is something there where
you and I and MAGA agree, but look at all these freaking midwits complaining and saying, no, this is absolutely essential. We have to keep these programs. How dare you cut them?
Well, right. But I thought you were saying that you were kind of giving like a little bit of a elbow to the MAGA people for like, hey, well, this is going to happen. And you were thinking you can have your funding of, legitimate science. No, this is, you know what I mean? Like that you were kind of chastising them for not having a good anarcho-capitalist framework.
Well, I would just say that you're going to lose some elections, right? And people that you don't like are going to be making these decisions and transing the mice. So maybe you shouldn't want to live in a system where that's going to happen every time you lose an election.
Yeah. Oh, by the way, did you see the thing with the numbers? So another one, folks, I totally forgot about it was, so Sabine, what's her name? Hassenfelder, something like that. I've actually interviewed her, and now I feel bad. I'm blanking on her last name, but she's a physicist, and she makes these real fun, provocative videos because she's kind of pivoted out of science and more into just popularizing stuff for the layperson, and she's got a wry sense of humor. And so she was criticizing so-called public funding of science and just pointing out all the boondoggles and whatnot. And so then some people were pushing back against her. And one guy who's a mathematician was saying his argument was, I'm against funding crazy stuff too, as Sabine is pointing out here. And a lot of the specifics she points to, she's right. But I mean, if you took her rhetoric at face value, that would mean there'd be no government funding of research at all. And that's just crazy. And like, so here, it even said, yes, there's a problem that when the government starts funding research, it's very narrow and it's a kind of thing where it appeals just a few experts on the globe. And, it's so abstract that there's essential, which is crazy. He said, hey, even back when I was in academia and I got some grants to do things that only 3 people on earth could even read my paper. So in that sense, my own research was BS. He literally said his own research was BS that was funded by the taxpayer. And then his next thing was, but let's not throw out the baby with the bathwater. Let's just consider how important, in general funding of math is. And he said, first of all, just consider numbers. Do you know how much economic value is added from having numbers? And then he moved on to his next point.
Well, hold on. We need to go back and credit a specific government with the creation of numbers.
Yes.
I don't want to leave them out.
Yeah. I think it was the Earl of Seven, and that's where that number comes from. So anyway, I mean, and so my joke at the time was, I remember, did you remember, Adam, when that Robert Mapplethorpe was under fire in the
Yeah.
like the late 80s or something, and he had all kinds of
Yeah.
obscene stuff, and he was getting funded by the tax. I mean, for folks who don't know, it was like a
A
crucifix in a vat of
and
urine,
yes,
like that.
yes.
Like tax dollars had been paying for that. So you can see how, among other people, Christian taxpayers, say, I don't think I want to support that financially. And so then the way they couched it was, it was like the National Endowment for the Arts was the thing,
Yeah.
and they were going to cut the
Yeah.
budget, the Republicans, blah, blah, blah. And then, of course, they held up Big Bird and said, well, some of the NEA budget goes and funds whatever the heck the thing is that funds Sesame Street. And so therefore, you want to kill Big Bird? And so I'm saying here that, you don't want to fund transgender mice? Well, then I guess you don't like having numbers.
Numbers, yeah, exactly. All good stuff, Bob. We're hitting at that point where we ought to wrap up. Do you have anything else for us, or?
No, I don't think so. There was the topless French women, but apparently that's too spicy for you.
I just wanted to show you the picture of the topless French women who
That's
bravely painted their torsos and ended fascism in France. We didn't need to talk about it. I just wanted to share some news with you.
Yes. Okay. I only read it for the articles. So
Exactly. All right, Bob. Well, this was great, ladies and gentlemen. If you are watching this on the Bob Murphy Show, and let's admit it, you probably are, go check out Heyman Nature on YouTube and heymannature.substack.com. And if the vice is versa, go check out the Bob Murphy Show, and we will catch you next time. Thank you.
thanks, everybody.
You've just experienced another episode of The Bob Murphy Show, the podcast promoting free markets, free minds, and grateful souls. For more information and to subscribe to this podcast, visit bobmurphyshow.com.